Nobody notices when a woman starts emotionally breaking because she usually does it quietly, while still answering messages, still being kind, still making sure everyone else feels loved before she allows herself to fall apart alone. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that has no clean explanation. It's not from overworking, not from a bad week, not from anything with a clear cause you could point to if someone asked. It's more ambient than that, more woven into the ordinary texture of the day. You wake up and it's already there, like it followed you out of sleep, and you move through your morning with it, and by midday you've already spent more energy managing how you appear than on anything you actually did. That specific tax, the one charged on presentation, on emotional maintenance, on the constant background work of being read correctly by everyone around you, it's so normalized that most women don't even register it as a cost anymore. It's just Tuesday. It's just the baseline. You stop noticing the weight when you've been carrying it long enough, but your body notices. Your patience notices. The version of you that surfaces at night when there's nothing left to perform, that version notices. Something happens to a woman's sense of self over time that isn't talked about with any real precision. It's not a loss, exactly. More like a slow redistribution. You give attention outward, to the people who need things from you, to the dynamics that require managing, to the version of yourself that keeps everything running. And somewhere in that process, the attention you were supposed to save for your own interior life quietly gets reallocated. Not all at once, just consistently, in small increments, over years. And then, one day, you're sitting somewhere unremarkable, in traffic, or at a table with people you know, or in a room that is by all measurable standards fine, and you feel something that isn't quite sadness and isn't quite emptiness, but lives in the same neighborhood as both. A faint, persistent awareness that something has been quietly missing for a while, and you're not fully sure when the missing started or what you'd even call it if you tried to name it out loud. You don't, though. Name it out loud. You file it somewhere internal and keep going. Because there's always something more immediately pressing, and because the honest answer to how are you actually doing requires a level of vulnerability that the current moment rarely seems to have space for. There's an irony buried in here that's worth looking at. Women are widely understood to be emotionally expressive, emotionally intelligent, emotionally available. And by many measures, that's accurate, but there's a version of emotional fluency that actually makes this harder, not easier. When you're good at understanding emotions, when you've spent years being the person others process things with, you become very practiced at holding emotional space for everyone except yourself. You know exactly how to sit with someone else's difficulty. You are considerably less practiced at sitting with your own. So your internal experiences don't go unnoticed. They go unaddressed, which is different and in some ways more isolating because you're aware enough to feel everything and yet somehow still don't make the time to actually deal with any of it. The friendships that have slowly drifted without a specific reason. The feelings about a relationship, past or present, that never got fully processed because processing them would have required admitting how much they actually mattered. The small, recurring heartbreak of being in a room full of people and feeling the familiar distance settle in, the sense of being surrounded and somehow still unreached. These things accumulate. And because none of them are dramatic enough to justify a crisis, they tend to just sit indefinitely in that internal collection of things you'll deal with later. What's worth noticing, and this is where something shifts slightly, is that the silence around these experiences isn't accidental. It's not simply that no one has created space for them. It's that a significant part of what women carry exists in a cultural blind spot, in the gap between what's visible and what's considered worth examining. The battles that leave no external evidence, the ones that don't produce a symptom anyone can see, a wound anyone can treat, a problem anyone can help solve. The exhaustion that comes from always being the one who holds things together. The loneliness of being deeply known by almost no one, despite being surrounded by people who would describe you as a close friend. The slow erosion of knowing what you actually want, separate from what everyone around you needs. The quiet grief of having edited yourself for so long that the original feels like something you'd have to relearn. These aren't small things, but they live in a register that doesn't often get addressed directly, because addressing them directly requires a level of honesty that cuts against the version of herself a woman is often expected to maintain. In the next part, we're going to look at each of these more closely, not as a checklist, not as a framework, but as a real examination of what these silent battles actually feel like from the inside, what they do over time, and why understanding them with some precision matters more than any surface-level reassurance ever could. Because the first step toward anything isn't fixing. It's finally seeing something clearly enough to stop misidentifying it. And what most of these battles have in common, underneath the surface, is something that most people, including the women experiencing them, haven't fully been shown yet. If this content speaks the words you can't explain, click subscribe. Thank you for your support. There's a version of disappearing that looks nothing like disappearing. You're still present, still responding to messages, still showing up, still doing the things that make you legible as a person who is managing fine. But somewhere underneath the functioning, there's a quiet withdrawal happening, so gradual and so internal that you might not have named it yet. A slow pulling back of the parts of yourself that feel too uncertain to risk exposing. Not out of coldness, out of something much closer to self-preservation. And the strange thing is, it mostly works. The withdrawal goes unnoticed because the surface stays intact, which means you get to keep the relationships, keep the reputation, keep the impression, and quietly lose access to the actual experience of any of it. There's a specific moment that happens in the middle of conversations that women rarely talk about. You're in the middle of explaining something real, something that actually matters to you. And you can feel, mid-sentence, the other person's attention starting to drift. Not rudely, just naturally, the way attention does. And something in you adjusts instantly, without deciding to. The sentence changes direction. The thing you were about to say becomes something lighter, something easier, something that doesn't require them to stay fully present to receive. And the original thought just doesn't get finished. It happens so quickly that you almost don't notice it happened. But some part of you does notice. Some part of you registered the moment you chose the easier version over the honest one and filed it away with all the other times you did the same thing. And the accumulation of those moments, all those redirected sentences, all those swallowed clarifications, starts to create a quiet, internal backlog. Things you meant to say, things you still mean, technically, things that are still there, somewhere, waiting for a version of the conversation that never quite arrives. The exhaustion that comes from this is specific. It's not the exhaustion of doing too much. It's the exhaustion of constant internal translation, of taking what you actually feel and processing it through the filter of what will land well, what won't overwhelm anyone, what can be said without requiring more emotional labor from people who are already giving you their limited attention. That translation process runs continuously. Most women have been running it for so long, they no longer notice the processing cost. They just notice, vaguely, that they're tired in a way that sleep doesn't touch. And then there's the related experience, subtler, harder to describe, of not being entirely sure what you feel before you've translated it, where you reach for your own honest reaction to something and find a pause, A brief blankness, like the original signal has been routed through the filter so many times that it no longer arrives in its original form. You know you feel something. You're just not always sure anymore what it actually is before you've already adjusted it for external consumption. Something quietly shifts in friendships when this goes on long enough. Not in a dramatic way, not with a falling out or a clear point of distance, just a slow cooling of a certain kind of intimacy, the kind that requires both people to bring something unpolished, something real and unfinished. You stop bringing that, not because you don't trust the person, but because you've learned through small repeated experiences that the unpolished version creates a kind of emotional weight that changes the dynamic. People soften around you when you're hurting. They help. And somehow, being helped, being handled gently, being the person who needed something, that feels like more of an exposure than the original pain did. So you keep things between you and the people you love at a specific temperature. Warm enough to feel real, controlled enough to stay safe. And you become, over time, someone people describe as having it together. Someone others come to with their own difficulties. Someone who gives more than she receives. Not because you planned it that way, but because that became the only version of closeness that felt manageable. There's a particular quality to the overthinking that happens late at night that's different from ordinary worry. It's not problem-solving. It's not anxiety in the clinical sense. It's more like a review. Your mind goes back over interactions from the day, things you said, things you didn't say, the tone of a response you received, the silence after something you offered, and it looks for information. Specifically, it looks for evidence about how you were received, whether you were too much or too little, whether something landed wrong, whether a relationship you value shifted in some small way you didn't fully clock in the moment. That review process isn't irrational. It's actually very precise. It's just pointed in the wrong direction, outward toward other people's responses, rather than inward toward what you actually needed from the interaction in the first place. And so you spend significant mental energy at midnight analyzing how you came across, while the question of how you actually felt, what you actually wanted from that conversation, barely enters the frame. The thing that ties all of this together, the withdrawal, the translated feelings, the managed closeness, the outward-facing overthinking, isn't obvious from inside it. From inside it, each of these just feels like being a reasonable, self-aware person navigating a complicated social world. Careful, considerate, not wanting to burden anyone unnecessarily. But there's a pattern underneath all of it that has a different shape when you look at it from a slight distance. A shape that suggests these aren't just habits or personality traits, they're responses, specifically calibrated, quietly maintained responses to something that got learned probably long before any of this felt like a choice. And what that something actually is, where it started, what it was protecting against, and why it has been so resistant to simply relaxing once the original conditions changed, that's what we're going to look at next. Because understanding the root doesn't just explain the pattern, it changes the way the pattern feels from the inside. And that's where things start to look genuinely different. At some point, something got established. Not through a single event, not through anything that would qualify as a story worth telling, but through repetition, through the slow accumulation of small social data about what happened when you took up a certain kind of space. What happened when you had needs that were inconvenient? What happened when you were too honest, or too much, or too visibly struggling? The feedback wasn't always explicit. Sometimes it was just a shift in energy, a withdrawal of warmth, a specific quality of silence. But it registered, and something in you drew a conclusion from it. That conclusion wasn't a thought you had. It was more like an operational adjustment, a quiet reorientation toward the version of yourself that produced better responses from the world around you. And that version, careful, capable, attuned to everyone else's emotional weather, became so practiced, so automatic, that it eventually stopped feeling like a strategy and started feeling like a self. Here's the part that's genuinely uncomfortable to look at. Most of the emotional patterns described in the previous sections, the translated feelings, the managed closeness, the midnight review pointed outward, they don't feel like self-protection from the inside. They feel like consideration, like maturity, like simply being someone who understands that other people have limits, that emotional demands are a lot to place on someone, that it's better to handle things yourself than to make your inner life someone else's problem. That framing is so reasonable, it's almost impossible to argue with. But reasonable framings can still be protective structures. And the question worth sitting with is not whether the framing is accurate, it probably is, in many ways, but what it's also doing, what it's making unavailable, what version of experience it quietly prevents. There's a specific fear that lives underneath a lot of this, and it doesn't usually announce itself as fear because it's been translated, like everything else, into something that sounds more rational. It shows up as not wanting to burden people, as not wanting to seem needy, as knowing that your problems aren't really that bad compared to what others are dealing with. These are the surface versions. The actual thing, if you follow it down past the reasonable language, is something closer to a deep uncertainty about whether your unmanaged self is someone people would choose to stay near. Not a dramatic fear, not a conscious belief you'd endorse if someone stated it plainly, just a functional assumption that's been running underneath everything, shaping choices, shaping the temperature of relationships, shaping which parts of your inner life ever make it into the light, and which ones get redirected back inward indefinitely. The terrible irony of this is that the very thing the protection was designed to prevent, disconnection, being too much, losing the relationship, is exactly what the protection quietly produces. Because you can't be genuinely close to someone you're also continuously managing your presentation around. The connection is real, but it's connecting with the edited version. And some part of you knows that if the unedited version ever fully emerged, you'd have no way of knowing how it would be received. And that uncertainty feels like too much to risk. So the management continues, and the closeness that exists stays at the specific depth that feels survivable. What tends to get confused inside all of this is the difference between who you actually are and who you learn to be to navigate the world without too much damage. Those two things can overlap significantly, genuinely, not just superficially, which makes separating them harder than it sounds. You might truly be someone who is considerate, emotionally attuned, careful about others. That can be authentically yours. But there are also pieces of that presentation that were added under pressure, that got reinforced because they worked, and that have stayed so long they've become indistinguishable from the original. Which specific parts are genuinely you, and which parts were adapted in? Most women find that question unsettling, not because it's difficult, but because they've quietly been avoiding it. Because sitting with it too long starts to unravel the stable self-image, the capable, composed, emotionally together version that has been, whatever its costs, at least reliably functional. There's also something that happens around emotional needs specifically that's worth naming without softening. Women are, in many contexts, permitted to be emotionally expressive, but there's a meaningful difference between expressing emotion and having emotional needs acknowledged as legitimate and worthy of response. The first is often welcomed, even celebrated. The second, actually needing something from someone, needing it consistently, needing it without apologizing for having needed it, tends to produce a very different kind of social response. One that a lot of women have learned to anticipate and preempt by simply not arriving at that need visibly in the first place. The need doesn't disappear. It just becomes something carried privately. Another item in the internal backlog. Another thing that exists in the space between what is felt and what is allowed to matter. The shape of all of this, when you pull back far enough to see it whole, is not the shape of weakness or damage. It's the shape of someone who paid very close attention to a particular set of social conditions over a long period of time and adapted accordingly, intelligently, precisely, in ways that allowed for survival, belonging, continuity. The cost of that adaptation is something most women sense rather than see directly. A vague awareness that something about their interior life has become less accessible than it used to be. That the distance between what they feel and what they let exist fully has grown incrementally over years without any single moment where the growth became obvious. But here is where something shifts. Not in a resolution, not in a fix, just in the quality of the seeing itself. Because once you understand that these patterns were responses, learned, reinforced, maintained for reasons that made complete sense at the time, the way you relate to them changes. They stop being evidence of who you are. They start being evidence of what you learned. And those two things, however similar they've always felt, are not the same thing at all. What that difference actually opens up, in the way you see yourself, in the way you experience your own emotional life going forward, that's where we're headed next. There's a difference between understanding something and actually seeing it. You can understand intellectually that you've been adapting yourself for years. You can follow the logic of it, trace it back, nod at the explanation, and still, somehow, go back to doing the exact same thing the next morning. Because understanding that lives only in the mind doesn't change the felt experience of being inside the pattern. It just adds a layer of self-awareness on top of the same behavior, which sometimes makes it lonelier, not less. The kind of seeing that actually shifts something is different. It's slower. It arrives not as a revelation, but as a quiet accumulation of small moments where you notice yourself in the act, where you catch the translation happening before it's complete, where you feel the redirect before the sentence has already changed direction. And those moments of noticing, unspectacular, often uncomfortable, are where something real starts to move. What tends to happen first when this kind of seeing begins is not relief. It's a specific quality of grief that's hard to place because it doesn't have a clean object. You're not grieving a loss you can name. You're grieving something more like an ongoing experience. All the ordinary interactions where you were present but not quite fully. All the moments of genuine feeling that got rerouted before they were allowed to exist completely. They didn't go anywhere dramatic. They just didn't go anywhere at all. And sitting with that is quieter and more uncomfortable than most people expect. That grief is worth something, though, not in a redemptive sense, not as a step in a process, just as information. It confirms that the parts of yourself you've been routing around are still there, still registering, still caring about being heard. The system didn't stop feeling. It just learned to manage feeling with extraordinary efficiency. And that efficiency is worth seeing clearly, not with contempt, not with relief, just clearly for what it actually is. One of the more disorienting realizations that tends to surface in this is how long certain things have been true that you told yourself were temporary. The sense of distance in your own social life. You told yourself it was a phase, a busy season, something that would ease once things settled. The feeling of not quite saying what you meant in conversations. You told yourself you were just choosing your timing, waiting for the right moment. The exhaustion that doesn't resolve with rest. You told yourself you'd address it once things calmed down. None of those were lies, exactly. They were reasonable interpretations. But they were also ways of making the ongoing feel provisional, of framing a settled condition as a temporary circumstance, and that framing kept things from being examined with any real seriousness, because you were always just about to arrive at the version of life where all of it resolved naturally. That version never quite arrived, and sitting with why it didn't is something different from blaming yourself for it. There's a quiet thing that starts to become visible when you stop organizing your self-perception around how well you're managing. Not a dramatic revelation, just a small, persistent question that begins to surface in the background of ordinary days. It doesn't ask whether you're okay in the functional sense. You are, mostly, in the functional sense. It asks something else, something more interior, something like, when is the last time you wanted something for yourself and followed that wanting without first running it through the filter of whether it would work for everyone around you? Not a rhetorical question, a real one, with a real answer that, if you let yourself find it honestly, probably lands somewhere uncomfortable, because the pattern of placing everyone else's emotional landscape before your own doesn't only show up in dramatic self-sacrifice, it shows up in small, ordinary choices. In the restaurant, you didn't suggest because someone else had a preference. In the conversation, you steered toward what the other person needed to talk about. In the creative thing you put aside, the opinion you softened, the boundary you didn't hold because holding it felt like more disruption than it was worth. Each of those moments is small. Accumulated over years, they add up to a life that has been quietly shaped around everyone else's comfort at a consistent cost to your own. What shifts when you really look at this is not the circumstances. The people in your life don't change. The dynamics don't immediately restructure. What shifts is the internal relationship to the pattern itself. It stops being invisible. And things that aren't invisible can, at least, be engaged with differently than things that aren't visible at all. You start to notice, for instance, the moment just before you redirect a sentence, and sometimes, just sometimes, you don't redirect it. Not because you've healed anything, not because you've decided to be bolder or more authentic, but because you caught it, and in the catching, there was a half second where the original version was still available, and you let it exist. That's not transformation. It's not a turning point. It's just a moment of less distance between what you felt and what you allowed to be real. And those moments are quieter than any breakthrough. They don't produce a feeling of progress. They just feel, briefly, like being slightly more present inside your own experience than you were the moment before. The battles that this video is about, the ones that go unnamed in the middle of perfectly functional lives, they don't end through insight alone. They're too old for that, too woven into ordinary behavior. But they do become, slowly, something you're in a different relationship with, not at war with, not recovered from, just seen, held with a kind of honesty that doesn't require resolution to be real. And maybe the most honest thing to say about all of it is this: you were never failing to manage your emotional life well enough. You were managing it too well, for too long, for reasons that made sense, at a cost that went unacknowledged. Seeing that doesn't fix anything, but it does change what the question becomes. And a different question is, quietly, a different beginning. If any part of this felt like something you've been carrying without quite having words for it, the managing, the distance, the redirect, the exhaustion that doesn't lift, I genuinely want to hear it. Not what you think you should feel about it, just what's actually true for you right now. Leave it in the comments. Because the most isolating thing about the battles in this video is how certain they make you that you're the only one running them, and you're not even close. So, which part of this felt the most familiar to you?